The factory side of it, because I mean I worked in a factory, as a lot of people did there.
At 77, former bandmate Tony Iommi breaks down in tears and reveals truth about Ozzy Osbourne. Tony Iommi was left in utter shock upon hearing the devastating news of Ozzy Osbourne's passing. Just one day earlier, the two had exchanged cheerful text messages, sharing jokes and memories as if nothing was wrong. For Tony Iommi, the suddenness of Ozzy's departure felt almost unreal, a blow that struck deeper because of their long history together in Black Sabbath. He admitted it was impossible to believe, as though a piece of rock history had vanished overnight, leaving behind an emptiness that words could hardly capture. Black Sabbath's humble beginnings. When people think of heavy metal, one name always emerges first: Black Sabbath. But before they became the pioneers of an entire genre, Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne were just two working-class kids from Birmingham, England, a city known more for its factories and smog than for music. Growing up in such an industrial landscape deeply shaped their outlook and eventually seeped into their music. Birmingham was tough, gray, and unromantic, but that very environment gave birth to something raw and powerful. Their journey began humbly with the formation of the Polka-Tulk Blues Band in the late 1960s, a group inspired by blues but still searching for an identity. The lineup went through changes. The name shortened to Earth, and their sound slowly evolved. However, it wasn't until they embraced darker themes, influenced by horror films and the unsettling atmosphere of their hometown, that their true vision emerged. They decided to call themselves Black Sabbath, borrowing the title from a 1963 Italian horror film. The new name captured their fascination with the macabre and instantly set them apart from other bands chasing the psychedelic trends of the time. The early years were anything but glamorous. They lacked money, relied on cheap instruments, and played in small pubs to crowds that often didn't know what to make of their ominous sound. Yet, those limitations fueled their creativity. Tony, having lost the tips of his fingers in a factory accident, reinvented the guitar's sound by detuning his strings, creating a darker, heavier tone that would become the foundation of heavy metal. Meanwhile, Ozzy's eerie, almost otherworldly voice gave their music a haunting edge that nobody else had. Their turning point came in 1970 with the release of their self-titled debut album, Black Sabbath, recorded in a single day. It captured the bleakness of their environment and the weight of their vision. The record was raw, unsettling, and unlike anything heard before. Critics dismissed it, but audiences were mesmerized. The follow-up album, Paranoid, released the same year, turned them into international stars, with tracks like Iron Man, War Pigs, and the iconic title track, Paranoid. They didn't just find success, they created a movement. The album defined the DNA of heavy metal: distorted riffs, heavy rhythms, dark themes, and an unapologetic intensity. From Birmingham's factories to the world's stage, Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne, along with Geezer Butler and Bill Ward, had built something entirely new. Their beginnings were marked by struggle, doubt, and rejection. But those very hardships forged the sound that would influence generations of musicians. Black Sabbath's rise was not simply about fame. It was about turning darkness into art and proving that even in the bleakest places, revolutionary music could be born. Chaos, conflict, and hard choices. By the late 1970s, Black Sabbath had become a global name, but behind the curtain, the cracks were widening. Ozzy Osbourne, once the haunting and magnetic voice of the band, was spiraling deeper into a world of alcohol and drugs. Rehearsals often began without him, and when he did show up, he was either too intoxicated to perform or completely absent in spirit. The unpredictability reached a breaking point, not just because of the erratic shows, but also because of the scandals that followed. Stories of Ozzy biting the head off a dove, later a bat, or even snorting a line of ants painted him less as a musician and more as a chaotic spectacle. What had once been eccentric energy now became destructive noise. The creative rift inside the band only grew larger. Tony Iommi, the architect of Black Sabbath's sound, was pushing for innovation. He wanted to evolve musically, to explore new textures and directions that could keep Sabbath relevant in a rapidly changing rock scene. Ozzy, however, seemed detached, disinterested in experimentation, and increasingly lost in his own haze. The sessions turned into battles, Tony's desire for discipline clashing with Ozzy's lack of focus. What had once been a united front now fractured into separate worlds, one reaching for reinvention, the other slipping into chaos. By 1979, the situation became untenable. The band reached a painful but inevitable conclusion. Ozzy had to go. Tony later admitted that it was one of the hardest decisions of his life. He described it as dismissing your own brother, but also acknowledged that there was no other way forward. The choice wasn't driven by malice, but by survival of the band, of the music, and perhaps even of Ozzy himself. Yet, in that moment, it felt like the end of everything they had built together. The aftermath was devastating. Ozzy felt betrayed, abandoned by the very group he had helped bring to life. Tony, on the other hand, carried guilt for years, haunted by the image of cutting ties with someone he had grown up with in Birmingham, someone who was more than a colleague. He was family. Their friendship, once forged in the fires of hardship and triumph, shattered under the weight of addiction and artistic differences. For nearly 2 decades, Tony and Ozzy did not speak, each pursuing separate paths, each scarred by the split. The decision to fire Ozzy was more than just a change in lineup. It was the breaking of a bond. Black Sabbath would move on with new singers, and Ozzy would surprisingly launch a solo career that skyrocketed. But the wound of 1979 remained deep. For Tony, it was a constant reminder of the cruel balance between loyalty and necessity. The internal crisis of Black Sabbath was not just the story of a band. It was the story of brothers forced apart by demons neither could fully control. Separate paths, parallel triumphs. When the painful split of 1979 left Ozzy Osbourne estranged from his Black Sabbath brothers, many believed his career was finished, dismissed as an unreliable frontman lost to addiction. Ozzy appeared destined to fade into the shadows of rock history. Yet, in one of the most astonishing turnarounds in music, he reinvented himself almost immediately. Teaming up with the virtuosic young guitarist Randy Rhoads, Ozzy launched his solo debut, Blizzard of Oz, in 1980. The album wasn't just a success, it was a revelation. Tracks like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley introduced a new energy that fused metal's heaviness with melody and flair. For Ozzy, this was more than a comeback. It was proof that he could survive, and even thrive, without Sabbath. His follow-up, Diary of a Madman, 1981, further solidified his position as a solo powerhouse. With Rhoads' dazzling guitar work and Ozzy's haunting voice, the record became a cornerstone of 1980s metal. Tragically, Rhoads' untimely death in 1982 cut short a partnership that could have reshaped the entire genre. But by then, Ozzy's solo identity was already cemented. Against all odds, he transformed himself from a dismissed vocalist into one of the most iconic frontmen in rock, carrying a larger-than-life persona that fans around the globe embraced. Meanwhile, Tony Iommi and the remaining members of Black Sabbath were determined to prove that the band was bigger than one man. Recruiting former Rainbow singer Ronnie James Dio, they injected fresh blood into the band's veins. Dio's soaring, operatic voice contrasted with Ozzy's raw, primal wail, but it gave Sabbath a new dimension. In 1980, they released Heaven and Hell, an album that shocked critics and fans alike with its power and vitality. Far from collapsing, Sabbath had reinvented itself. Songs like Neon Nights and the epic title track proved the band could evolve and remain a force in the changing landscape of heavy metal. The momentum continued with Mob Rules, 1981, an album brimming with energy and ambition. Tracks like The Sign of the Southern Cross and Turn Up the Night showcased a band that refused to be written off. For Tony, this period was vindication. Sabbath had lost its founding voice, yet it had not lost its identity. With Dio, they not only survived but flourished, standing shoulder to shoulder with the emerging giants of the 1980s metal scene. The parallel successes of Ozzy and Black Sabbath created one of rock's most fascinating narratives. On one side stood Ozzy, the madman, reborn, dazzling arenas as a solo artist with a new band, shocking the world with his outrageous antics, yet backed by undeniable talent. On the other side stood Tony and Sabbath, resilient and determined, carrying the torch of heavy metal with renewed strength. Instead of one path dominating the other, both thrived simultaneously, each proving that the spirit of Sabbath's origins, dark, heavy, and uncompromising, could manifest in different forms. Though resentment lingered, there was also a strange sense of balance. Ozzy's triumphs did not erase Sabbath's legacy, and Sabbath's survival did not overshadow Ozzy's reinvention. Both paths enriched the genre, laying foundations for future metal bands while captivating millions of fans worldwide. Looking back, the early 1980s stand not as the death of Black Sabbath, but as the birth of two empires running side by side, an extraordinary testament to the resilience of rock and the creative spark that Tony and Ozzy, even apart, continued to ignite. Reunion and healing. By the mid-1990s, decades of bitterness, silence, and distance had passed between Ozzy Osbourne and Tony Iommi. Yet beneath the scars of their history lingered a bond too deep to ignore, the bond of two men who had together invented heavy metal. The first true step toward healing came in 1997, when Sharon Osbourne suggested that Ozzy and Black Sabbath headline Ozzfest. For fans, the announcement felt almost impossible. After nearly 2 decades apart, the classic lineup was returning, when Ozzy, Tony, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward stepped onto the stage together. It was more than a concert. It was a resurrection. The roar of the crowd reminded them that, despite all their conflicts, their music had always united millions. The momentum of that reunion led to the 1998 live album Reunion, recorded in Birmingham, their hometown. The album symbolized a full circle moment. The sons of a working-class city had gone their separate ways, but had come home again. Alongside live versions of classics like Iron Man and War Pigs, the record featured 2 new songs, Psycho Man and Selling My Soul. Though critics debated the quality of these tracks, the deeper meaning was clear. Sabbath could still create together. For Tony and Ozzy, it was a fragile but genuine sign that their partnership had life left in it. Still, reconciliation was not easy. The memories of late 1970s chaos, missed rehearsals, addictions, anger, and the painful decision to fire Ozzy lingered like shadows. In interviews, Tony often admitted he felt both pride and sorrow when looking back at their history. Ozzy, for his part, alternated between gratitude for being given another chance and bitterness over how things had ended years before. Their dynamic was complicated, but for the first time in decades, both men were trying. The ultimate proof of their healing came years later with the release of 13 in 2013, produced by Rick Rubin. The album was the first Black Sabbath studio record with Ozzy on vocals since 1978's Never Say Die. For fans, it was a miracle. Tracks like God Is Dead and End of the Beginning showcased the band's ability to stay heavy, relevant, and authentic even after more than 40 years. Commercially, the album was a triumph, reaching #1 on charts worldwide. Spiritually, it was even more important. It proved that Sabbath's story had never truly ended. Behind the scenes, the sessions for 13 were emotional. Tony was battling lymphoma during the recording, while Ozzy was struggling with his ongoing health issues and sobriety. Instead of driving them apart, these challenges created a new sense of solidarity. Both men had weathered storms, both had grown older, and both knew that time was no longer infinite. In the studio, there was less ego and more gratitude. Tony later admitted that watching Ozzy pour his heart into the microphone reminded him of the magic they had discovered as teenagers in Birmingham. Ozzy, in turn, described Tony as the anchor that always kept Sabbath grounded. Reunion brought healing, laughter, and memories. Scars remained, but they chose brotherhood. In many ways, their journey reflects the essence of rock itself: chaotic, destructive, but also resilient and unifying. Black Sabbath's reunion was not merely about nostalgia. It was about proving that even fractured friendships can find harmony again. For Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne, the healing process was imperfect, but it was real. And in the end, their music remained the truest bridge between them, echoing across generations as a reminder that some bonds, though battered, can never truly be broken. Ozzy's struggles, Tony's strength. As the story of reunion and healing carried into the 21st century, a new chapter emerged, one defined not by music charts or sold-out tours, but by the fragility of human health. Ozzy Osbourne, long known as the Prince of Darkness, began facing a battle far more personal than any stage performance. Diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2003, but keeping it private for nearly 2 decades, Ozzy's condition gradually worsened. By the time he revealed the truth publicly in 2020, the signs were already clear: multiple surgeries, frequent falls, and an increasing reliance on wheelchairs to move around. For a man who had once embodied raw energy and chaos on stage, these physical limitations were both heartbreaking and humbling. Through this decline, one of the most consistent sources of support came from an unexpected place: Tony Iommi, the man who had once fired him from Black Sabbath. Despite decades of past conflict, Tony quietly became a pillar of strength for his old bandmate. He visited Ozzy frequently, offering encouragement not just as a colleague, but as a friend who understood the weight of carrying a legendary legacy while struggling with the limits of the body. Unlike the public drama of their earlier years, this chapter was defined by quiet gestures of care and loyalty. Tony's support extended beyond personal visits. When Ozzy began recording Ordinary Man 2020 and later Patient Number 9 2022, Tony stood behind him, not as a dominant creative force, but as an anchor of reassurance. These albums, deeply introspective and tinged with mortality, showed a vulnerable side of Ozzy that fans rarely witnessed before. And while guest stars like Elton John, Post Malone, and Eric Clapton contributed, It was Tony's presence, offering moral support and sometimes even musical input, that grounded Ozzy during the process. This silent partnership reflected something deeper than music. Both men had survived decades of excess, addiction, and conflict. Now, in the twilight of their careers, they stood not as rivals or reluctant partners, but as brothers bound by shared history. Tony himself had battled lymphoma, and his empathy for Ozzy's Parkinson's was rooted in his own struggles with mortality. Together, they found strength in simply being there for one another, proving that the bond forged in the fires of heavy metal could endure even as their bodies weakened. For fans, the sight of Tony standing beside Ozzy during interviews, public appearances, or in heartfelt tributes symbolized more than nostalgia. It was a reminder that even legends need care, and that reconciliation is not just about music, but about humanity. Last show, Eternal Goodbye, following years of health struggles and quiet support from Tony Iommi. The story of Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath reached its final chapter on July 5, 2025. The band returned to Birmingham, the industrial city where it all began, for a farewell concert aptly titled Back to the Beginning. For fans, it was not just another show, but a moment of history, a circle completed after more than 5 decades of heavy metal dominance. The stage was minimal but symbolic. At its center sat Ozzy Osbourne, not leaping and screaming like in his youth, but seated on a black throne-like chair. His posture betrayed fatigue, his hands trembling slightly from the effects of Parkinson's, yet his eyes burned with pride and gratitude. When he raised the microphone to address the crowd, the stadium erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very ground of Birmingham. The set list was carefully chosen. Black Sabbath, Iron Man, Paranoid, and other timeless anthems that had once terrified critics and electrified millions. Each note carried an unspoken awareness. This would be the last time these songs were performed by their creators on home soil. Tony Iommi's guitar roared with a sense of finality. Geezer Butler's bass thundered like a heartbeat, and Ozzy's voice, though weaker, was delivered with raw sincerity that transcended technical imperfections. Fans wept openly, waving banners that read, "Thank you, Ozzy," and "Forever Sabbath." Some had traveled from across the globe, knowing they were witnessing more than a concert. It was a goodbye to an era that defined heavy metal itself. At one point, Ozzy, visibly emotional, whispered into the microphone, "This isn't the end of the music, but it's the end of our journey together. Thank you for my life." The words silenced the stadium for a moment before giving way to thunderous applause. The emotional climax came with Paranoid, their most famous song. The audience sang louder than Ozzy, effectively carrying him through the performance. As the final chords faded, fireworks lit the night sky of Birmingham, marking both a celebration and an elegy. Tony walked over to Ozzy, placed a hand on his shoulder, and the two shared a quiet glance, one of forgiveness, friendship, and the recognition of a legacy that would outlive them both. The concert ended not with chaos or spectacle, but with humility. The lights dimmed, and on the giant screen appeared the words, "From Birmingham to the world, thank you, Black Sabbath, 1968-2025. For those present, it was a collective farewell not only to Ozzy Osbourne, but to a band that transformed the language of rock forever. Farewell echoes, worldwide grief. Only weeks after the emotional farewell concert in Birmingham, tragedy struck. On July 22, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne passed away peacefully at his home, aged 76. The news spread like wildfire across the globe, leaving fans, fellow musicians, and journalists in shock. For many, it felt unreal. Ozzy had always been the indestructible Prince of Darkness, a man who had survived countless scandals, addictions, and health battles. To imagine a world without him seemed impossible. Within hours of the announcement, tributes poured in from every corner of the music world. Tony Iommi called him my brother in riffs. Sharon Osbourne simply wrote, "My heart is broken." While artists from Metallica to Post Malone shared personal stories of how Ozzy's music had changed their lives, on social media, hashtags like "Aich, Thank You Ozzy" and "Us Forever Sabbath" trended worldwide, reflecting the immense impact he had on multiple generations. Public mourning took many forms. In Birmingham, thousands of fans gathered in Victoria Square, lighting candles and singing Paranoid together in a haunting yet beautiful chorus. In Los Angeles, street artists painted massive murals of Ozzy, portraying him both as the wild-eyed rocker biting a bat and as the elder statesman of heavy metal. Across Europe and Latin America, radio stations dedicated entire days to playing Black Sabbath and Ozzy's solo classics, transforming the airwaves into a global requiem. Journalists described his passing as the end of an era, and with good reason. Ozzy was not just a singer. He was a symbol of rebellion, resilience, and the raw energy of rock. His death marked the closing of a chapter that began in the smoky clubs of Birmingham in the late 1960s and evolved into a worldwide cultural movement. Critics and fans alike agreed, without Ozzy, heavy metal would never have existed in the form it does today. But beyond the headlines and public spectacles, there was also an intimate sadness. Fans who had grown up with his music shared stories of how his songs carried them through dark times, gave them strength, or provided a soundtrack to their youth. For many, losing Ozzy was like losing a member of the family. As the days passed, discussions began about a state memorial concert featuring surviving Black Sabbath members and a lineup of artists influenced by Ozzy. Yet, for most, the true tribute was simpler: turning up the volume, blasting Crazy Train or War Pigs, and remembering the man who taught the world that music could be both terrifying and liberating. Tony Iommi's Tears, Ozzy's Truth. In the days following Ozzy Osbourne's death, tributes from around the world painted him as the Prince of Darkness who changed the face of heavy metal. But for Tony Iommi, who had shared a lifetime of friendship, conflict, and reconciliation with Ozzy, the loss cut much deeper. In an emotional interview, Tony broke down in tears as he recalled their final moment on stage at Birmingham's farewell concert on July 5th, 2025. Sitting beside Ozzy as the crowd roared, he leaned over and heard Ozzy whisper, "It went all right, didn't it?" To Tony, that quiet, vulnerable question summed up the man behind the legend, a man still searching for reassurance, even at the end of a triumphant career. Tony confessed that the public never truly knew the real Ozzy. While the world saw the wild antics, the bat, the drugs, the scandals, Tony insisted that beneath the chaos was a deeply kind, generous, and affectionate soul. "He was my brother," Iommi said, his voice breaking. "And he was one of the kindest men I've ever met." He gave examples that rarely reached the headlines. When Sharon Osbourne battled cancer, Ozzy stayed by her side tirelessly, putting aside his own troubles to be her strength. He often visited sick fans in hospitals, showing up quietly, away from cameras, just to hold their hands and give them a few moments of joy. Tony also reminded people of Ozzy's humility. During his sober years, he repeatedly apologized, both publicly and privately, for the chaos his addictions had caused, admitting his mistakes with disarming honesty. For Tony, these moments defined Ozzy more than the stage spectacles ever could. People called him crazy, But he was full of love, Iommi explained. He gave more of himself than anyone realized. He carried guilt. He carried pain. But he also carried people through their darkest times with his music and with his heart. He admitted that their friendship had endured decades of turbulence, fights, fallouts, and long silences. But when they reunited in the late 1990s, Tony began to see Ozzy in a new light. He wasn't just the frontman of Sabbath, he said. He was my family. We went through hell together, and somehow we kept finding our way back. As tears streamed down his face, Tony concluded the interview with a message that revealed the depth of his grief. The world lost a rock icon. I lost my brother. And I just hope people remember the Ozzy I knew, the gentle soul who wanted nothing more than to make people smile. Ozzy Osbourne's enduring legacy. From Tony Iommi's heartfelt confession, it becomes clear that Ozzy Osbourne's true legacy goes far beyond the shocking headlines and theatrical chaos that defined much of his career. His greatest gift to the world was the creation of a new musical language, heavy metal, that inspired generations of musicians across the globe. With Black Sabbath, Ozzy transformed darkness and industrial despair into powerful art. And as a solo artist, he proved resilience and reinvention were possible even after personal downfall. Beyond music, his authenticity, humor, and humanity made him beloved far outside the rock community. The outpouring of grief after his passing, candlelight vigils, murals, and tributes demonstrated how deeply he touched people's lives. His songs, often born from pain, became sources of healing and empowerment. For many, Ozzy symbolized not just rebellion, but survival. His legacy is that of a man who turned chaos into beauty, who carried scars yet shared love, and who showed that even the Prince of Darkness could be a beacon of light. Plans for remembrance. After the wave of grief and Tony Iommi's emotional tribute, the guitarist revealed that he is preparing concrete plans to honor Ozzy Osbourne in the most meaningful way. First, he intends to release a treasure trove of never-before-heard Black Sabbath recordings, which will serve not just as music, but as a living chronicle of Ozzy's journey, his voice, struggles, and triumphs captured forever. Beyond the music, Tony is also working on establishing the Ozzy Osbourne Foundation, a charity dedicated to funding research into Parkinson's disease, the very illness that shadowed Ozzy's later years. This initiative reflects both a commitment to science and a deeply personal gesture of love and loyalty. For Tony, keeping Ozzy's memory alive is not simply about nostalgia. It is about ensuring that future generations understand the depth of his friend's artistry and humanity. Through these projects, Ozzy's name will continue to echo, not only in heavy riffs and anthems, but also in acts of compassion and hope.